What happens if the largest robot factory ever built erases more jobs than the entire American workforce? China just finished it. And that's the terrifying part. 200 million jobs gone within 20 years because of buildings like this. It sits in southern China, in the dark. No shift change, no voices. Inside, robots are building more robots around the clock, with almost no one there. One rolls off the line every 30 minutes. It works for under $3 an hour. No human worker on Earth can match that. Now imagine 1,000 of these factories. Machines making our cars, our phones, our homes with no human hands at all. So here's the real question. What happens when one country can build everything the world needs without needing its own people to build it? What's left for everyone else? For the workers? For the countries that fall behind? For you? Stay with me until the end. Because this isn't a forecast. It's a new era built on an idea humans have chased for centuries. How were these machines really born? And why does the world barely need our hands anymore? To understand that, we have to go back to the moment a factory first ran out of people, the model that ran out of people. For 30 years, China's advantage had a very simple shape. It was people. Hundreds of millions of them, moving out of the countryside into factory towns, working for wages no Western country could match. If you wanted something made cheaply, that is where it got made. And every company on Earth quietly rebuilt itself around that one fact. It was the largest movement of human beings in recorded history, and it happened inside a single lifetime. Whole cities appeared where there had been farmland. Dormitories went up beside the plants. Families split across 1,000 miles, so one person could send money home every month. Then the arithmetic began to turn. Slowly at first, then all at once. The thing that had made China unbeatable started to run out. Wages rose, which is exactly what happens when a country gets richer, and exactly what everyone said they wanted. A factory job in Guangdong stopped being the cheapest labor on the planet, and the companies that had come for cheap labor started looking at Vietnam, at Bangladesh, at anywhere the number was lower. That alone would have been manageable. A country can absorb rising wages. What it cannot easily absorb is running out of young workers at any price, because something else was moving underneath all of it, and it had been set in motion decades earlier. The generation that filled those factory floors was getting older, and the generation behind them was smaller by design. The long arithmetic of the one-child policy finally coming due. You could see the date coming from a long way off. Fewer hands every year, each one more expensive than the last, in a country whose entire position in the world had been built on having more hands than anybody else. There is something genuinely strange about watching a country recognize the expiry date on its own advantage. Most nations don't. They defend the thing that made them successful long after it has stopped working, because too many people have built careers on it, and because admitting it is over sounds like losing. Most governments would have spent a decade arguing about it. In 2015, Beijing published a plan instead. They called it Made in China 2025, and underneath the diplomatic language, it made one decision that mattered more than the rest. Stop defending cheap labor, replace it. It is worth appreciating how uncomfortable that decision must have been. The cheap labor model had lifted more people out of poverty faster than any economic arrangement in modern history. Announcing its replacement meant telling a generation that the thing that had worked for them was finished, and the target was not simply to use more robots. Anyone with money can buy robots. The target was to build them. That distinction is everything. Buying robots makes your factories cheaper. Building robots makes everyone else's factories depend on you. One is an upgrade. The other is leverage. At the time, that sounded close to absurd. China was importing roughly 75% of the industrial robots it installed, buying the machines that were supposed to secure its own future from the countries it was competing against. Today, it makes 57% of the robots it uses itself. That flip is the whole story in one line. It is the difference between renting your tools from a rival and owning the factory that makes the tools. Which raises an obvious question. What does a factory actually look like when it is built by a country that has decided to stop hiring? The factory where robots build robots. It sits in Foshan, in Guangdong province. From the road, it looks like any other industrial shed in southern China. Gray, enormous, unremarkable. Walk inside and the first thing you notice is not what's there, it's what isn't. There is no shift change. No canteen noise drifting across the floor at midday. No cluster of people at a doorway. No supervisor walking the line with a clipboard. The lights don't go down at 6 because there is nothing there that needs to go home. Every factory you have ever seen or imagined has a human rhythm buried in it. The morning arrival, the slowdown before lunch, the lift in energy on a Friday, the drag on a Monday, the tired hour late in a night shift when mistakes creep in. Strip the people out and all of that disappears at once. What's left doesn't run in shifts, it just runs. No holidays, no sick days, no slow first hour on a Monday. The only thing that stops the line is a decision to stop it, and nobody in the building is inclined to make one. Robotic arms swing parts into position and set them with a precision no human hand can hold for 8 hours, let alone 80. Overhead, AI-powered cameras inspect every joint and seam as it passes, catching flaws too small and too fast for an eye to register. Driverless forklifts glide between stations, carrying components to whichever line needs them next, threading past each other without hesitating. And then there's the detail that takes a second to land. The object being assembled on that line is another robot. Not a car door, not a phone casing. The same kind of machine doing the assembling. Machines, building machines, around the clock, with almost nobody involved. One finished unit rolls off roughly every 30 minutes, 17,000 a year out of this single site. And the line does not care whether it is Tuesday afternoon or 3 in the morning on a public holiday. Sit with that for a moment longer than is comfortable. Somewhere in that building, a robotic arm is fitting a joint into a robotic arm. The tool and the product have become the same object, and the loop has closed. But the part that should genuinely change how you think about this isn't the speed at all. At the end of each day, the system reviews its own mistakes. Every defect the cameras caught gets fed back through the software, which works out where the drift is coming from and recalibrates the line overnight. So the factory that starts on Tuesday morning is fractionally better than the one that finished on Monday night. Nobody had to notice. Nobody had to file a report or convene a meeting or push a change through a committee. Think about what that does over time. A conventional factory improves when a human being spots a problem and decides to act on it. Which means it improves at the speed of attention how quickly someone notices, how motivated they are, whether anyone above them listens. This one improves whether or not anyone is paying attention at all. It compounds, quietly, the way interest does. And compounding is the most underestimated force in industry. A line that gets a fraction of a percent better every night is not noticeably better next week. Across a year, it has pulled away from a competitor who is still holding meetings about it. One building like that is a remarkable piece of engineering. The real question is whether it's an exception or a template, because a single showpiece proves nothing. A country only changes the world when it can do the same thing again and again. In 1,000 buildings, nobody films. 9 times America. Showpiece factories are the oldest trick in industry. Every country has one. A gleaming sight the cameras are invited to, running well ahead of everything else the nation actually does, built partly to work and partly to be photographed. Judge a country by its best factory, and you will be wrong almost every time. Germany has them. Japan has them. The United States has a handful that get filmed constantly and represent almost nothing about the average American plant. A single spectacular building tells you what a country can do when it is trying to impress you, not what it does on an ordinary Wednesday. So, the honest test was never Foshan. It was whether anything outside Foshan looked remotely like it. In 2024, China installed close to 295,000 new industrial robots, not built, not ordered, installed, bolted down, wired in, and put to work in a single year. Slow that number down and it becomes hard to hold. It is a new robot going into service somewhere in the country roughly every 2 minutes, day and night, through weekends and holidays, for 12 straight months, every 2 minutes, through the night, through Lunar New Year, through every week of a year in which most of the world's manufacturing press was writing about something else entirely. For comparison, the United States installed about 1/9 as many in the same year. Sit with that ratio rather than the raw number, because the ratio is the part that compounds. It isn't a country that is slightly ahead. It's a country installing roughly 9 machines for every one going into American plants in the same 12 months, in a competition where every installed machine permanently lowers the cost of everything that factory makes after it. And this isn't one industry running hot while the rest stands still. The robots are going into electronics, plants and car factories, into food production and textiles, the ordinary, unglamorous middle of an economy, the industries that employ the most people and get written about the least. That distinction matters more than it sounds. A robot in a car plant is a story about cars. Robots arriving in food and textiles at the same time is a story about work itself. Car plants were automated decades ago. That fight is old news. Textiles were supposed to be the last refuge of cheap human labor. the industry that moves from country to country, chasing the lowest wage on earth. When robots start arriving there, the chase is over, because there is nowhere cheaper left to run to. What you're watching in that number is a policy turning into a habit. A government can announce a plan. It cannot, by decree, make thousands of separate factory owners spend their own money on the same bet in the same year. That only happens once the maths has become obvious to everyone independently, once buying the machine is simply cheaper than not buying it. And that is a much harder thing to reverse than a policy. Policies change with governments. A calculation that every factory owner in a country has already run for themselves does not. At that point, automation stops being a strategy and starts being the default. Nobody has to be persuaded anymore. That is the quiet threshold every technology has to cross. And almost nobody notices the year it happens. There is no announcement. The arguing simply stops, because the answer has become obvious to everyone at roughly the same time. Which is why the interesting question stopped being whether machines would replace workers in China. It became how quickly, and what happens to everyone standing in the way. If a country installing a robot every 2 minutes for a year sounds like something we should all have been paying closer attention to, type one word in the comments: insane. The arithmetic that ends a job. Numbers that large stop landing in a factory at some point. They land on people. Estimates suggest automation could displace around 26% of China's workforce within 2 decades. In people, that is more than 200 million of them. That figure is so large it turns into wallpaper, so shrink it until it means something. It is roughly the entire population of Brazil, out of work, inside a single generation. And it isn't a forecast waiting to begin. In smaller industrial cities, the places that never appear in a documentary about Chinese technology factories have already cut shifts. Some have closed altogether. These are towns that exist because of a plant. The restaurants across the road, the shops, the bus route, the rents, all of it arranged around a building where a few thousand people used to walk in every morning. When the shifts thin out, the town thins out with them, slowly enough that no single day looks like a crisis. These were never glamorous jobs. They were long, repetitive, and hard on a body. But they were also the arrangement that moved a family from a village into an apartment, put a child through school, and made the last 30 years mean something to the people who lived through them. A machine that costs $3 an hour does not need any of that to be true. That is the hardest thing about automation to talk about honestly. Nobody involved is a villain. The factory owner installing robots is trying to stay in business against competitors already doing it. The worker losing a shift did nothing wrong, and no single decision anywhere in that chain looks unreasonable from the inside. Now, to be fair to Beijing, none of this is being ignored. There are retraining programs. There is real, genuine growth in robotics work. People who install these systems, maintain them, write the software that runs them, and diagnose them when a line goes down at 2 in the morning. Those jobs are better paid and better protected than the ones being lost. That part is true, and it deserves saying. The problem is where those jobs are and who can reach them. The new work clusters in big cities and demands skills that take years to build. The losses land in smaller towns, in older workers, in exactly the people least able to move house or start again. A 52-year-old who has spent 20 years on an assembly line in a second-tier city is not one training course away from maintaining a fleet of industrial robots, and pretending otherwise helps nobody. So the jobs don't simply vanish. That would almost be cleaner. They reappear somewhere else, for someone else, usually younger and usually several hundred miles away, which is a much harder thing to build a policy around than a job that simply disappears. You cannot compensate someone for work that still exists, just not for them, and not where they live. And all of this is happening inside the country that is building the robots, the one country in the world getting the economic upside of this trade, which raises the uncomfortable question for everybody else. Why the West cannot simply come home? The answer you hear in Washington and Brussels is always the same one: bring manufacturing home. It sounds obvious, and it is genuinely popular, and it runs into a wall almost immediately. It gets promised in election campaigns on both sides of the Atlantic, usually in a town that used to have a plant. And the promise is always framed the same way, as though the factories left because someone made a bad deal, and a better deal would bring them back. To compete on price, a factory has to automate. Western wages cannot go anywhere near $3 an hour, and no amount of political will changes that. So the plan, in practice, is not to bring back jobs. It's to bring back production, and production now means robots, which is where it gets awkward. A significant share of the world's industrial robots, and many of the core components inside them, now come from China. So the strategy for competing with China involves placing a very large order with China. And that dependency does not sit quietly in a spreadsheet. It sits in every trade negotiation, every export restriction, every conversation about what happens if relations get worse. A country that controls the machines that make things has a hand on a switch, and everybody in the room knows where the switch is. Meanwhile, the same cost advantage is being quietly folded into everything the country exports: electric vehicles, solar panels, semiconductors. When the machines that build a product cost almost nothing to run, that saving doesn't stay in the factory. It travels all the way to the price on the other side of the world and undercuts whoever is trying to compete there. This is what makes it something more than an industrial story. A tariff can be answered with another tariff, but you cannot tariff your way around needing to buy your competitor's tools in order to compete with your competitor. Which is why this argument keeps going in circles in every capital that has tried to have it. The problem was never really where the factories are. It's who makes the things inside them. If that trap is more serious than you realized, drop one word below: trapped. The robots that look like us. Everything you've seen so far still has one enormous limitation, and it's the reason plenty of people have slept soundly through the last decade of automation headlines. An industrial robot is brilliant and completely narrow. It is bolted to a floor. It performs one motion, in one place, in a space built specifically around it. Move it 3 feet or change the task, and it is useless until somebody reprograms it. That is why automation has spent 40 years eating a very particular kind of job, repetitive, predictable, and stationary, and left everything else alone. Which is exactly the assumption China is now spending heavily to break. The next wave is humanoid robots. Machines built not for a production cell, but for the messy, unstructured places people work: a warehouse aisle stacked badly, a construction site that changes shape every week, a room designed around human bodies rather than machines. And that shift matters far more than it sounds, because of what it does to the jobs everyone assumed were safe. Those jobs were never safe because they were skilled. They were safe because they were messy. Because the task changed constantly, the environment was unpredictable, and somebody had to walk around, look at things, pick up the odd-shaped object and work out what to do with it. A machine that can handle mess is a machine that reaches into all of it. Warehouse picking, site clearance, loading, sorting, fetching, tidying, the enormous category of work that is physically simple and situationally complicated, and that has quietly employed a very large share of the people you know. Right now, humanoid robots are expensive, awkward, and nowhere near ready to replace a warehouse crew. Anyone telling you otherwise is selling something. But the cost curve is bending, and it is bending in the direction it always bends once manufacturing scale arrives. We have watched that curve before, with solar panels, batteries, flat screens. The pattern rarely changes once a country decides to manufacture something at volume. At some point, the comparison stops being a technical argument and becomes a straightforward calculation done by an accountant who has never thought about robotics in their life. Which brings us to the part of this story that is genuinely different from every industrial revolution before it. It isn't the machines. Machines have been replacing people since the loom. It's the speed. The great industrial transformations of the past unfolded across decades. Generations grew up inside them. Societies had time to argue, to legislate, to retrain, to invent whole new categories of work and whole new political movements to fight over them. The disruption was enormous, but it arrived slowly enough that people could adapt while it happened. This one is running on a government timetable, and it is being measured in years. That is the advantage nobody put on a poster. Not cheaper robots, a shorter distance between deciding something and doing it. Democracies argue at the speed of elections, and there is real value in that. But the assembly line in Foshan does not pause for a consultation period, and it does not slow down while anyone works out what they think. There is a reason that matters beyond manufacturing. Every society that has come through a technological upheaval intact did it by buying time. Time to retrain, to rewrite the rules, to argue its way to something people could live with. Take the time away, and you don't get a gentler transition. You just get the same disruption, arriving before anyone has agreed what to do about it. While the rest of the world debates what any of this means, the line keeps running. So here is what this was actually about. Not one impressive factory. A country that stopped competing on the price of its people and started competing on the machines that replaced them, then made sure it owned the factories that build those machines at a pace no democratic country can match politically. That's the part that outlasts the headline. A cost advantage can be answered, a tariff can be matched. But when the tools themselves come from one place, everyone else is negotiating from inside a building somebody else built. For 200 years, the country that made things most cheaply set the terms for everybody else. That has not changed. What changed is that making things cheaply no longer requires having the most people, only the most machines, and the will to install them faster than anyone can object. And the strangest part is how quiet it is. No announcement, no dramatic moment anyone can point to. Just a gray building outside a city you'd struggle to find on a map, where the lights stay on all night and nobody is working. So tell me what you think in the comments. And I mean it, I read every one. Do you believe the West can still catch up on automation? Or did that window close while everyone was arguing about tariffs? And if this changed how you think about where things get made, hit like and subscribe. That's the whole reason I get to keep making these. Somewhere tonight, in a building with nobody in it, another one is being finished, and then another, and nobody there will ever know we were talking about it.